Donald Trump isn't very much a details guy. And so in his mind, I think he has achieved some of those legacy defining aims of really going for it when it comes to Iran.
What needs to happen is for this war to end as quickly as possible, and more importantly, the Strait of Hormuz to open as quickly as possible to relieve some of that economic pain.
This has kind of become a waiting game between the Iranians and the Trump administration to see who can kind of hold on to this kind of painful circumstance the longest.
Both of you at the White House have obviously been incredibly busy, especially as President Trump has continued to speak on and write on Truth Social on the war. And right now we're in this holding pattern, aren't we? To see whether this ceasefire does indeed hold, whether it runs out before an agreement is reached. And right now, there's a lot of posturing still on both sides. So it's not clear, although there's optimism on the side of the White House saying these talks are progressing well, it's not clear uh, where we're actually going to end up.
I sort of feel like that's where we've been for most of this war. A lot of this has been done through back channels. There's been very little like very few moments where we have seen these, public talks, as we saw with the vice president in Pakistan over the weekend. And so, a lot of this is trying to parse together what we're getting from the US side, what we're getting from Tehran, what we're getting from the intermediaries. But it does seem that, at least from folks I've spoken to over at the White House, that, both sides really don't want the fighting to continue. There's been a lot of devastation in the Gulf. This has wreaked havoc on, the American economy, caused this global energy crisis. So I think there is incentive there to at least extend this ceasefire as these conversations play out.
And I think part of it is also that the blockade and then the kind of separate financial track aimed at cutting Iran off from banks in the Middle East and in China, that allows the administration to kind of keep pressure on Iran without returning to major combat operations, which really aren't particularly popular in the US. So it's kind of a carrot and stick approach, but at the same time, it's kind of addressing those concerns that Americans had that the bombing campaign could drag on much further, or potentially lead to something more involved on the ground. I think that's something the administration is very aware of too, and I think that's also part of why they're so kind of optimistic and seem to be hoping that these talks produce a result of some kind that they can claim as a win.
You already hear some of the messaging, or we have around that, with the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth continuing in his statements to say the new regime better choose wisely. The new regime is working with us so far, but we're ready if they don't. And so, in the messaging that we hear from President Trump and his allies, it is clear that regime change has been, in their sense, more or less ticked off. Degrading Iran's military has been ticked off, and now it is the Strait of Hormuz reopening. And I found it interesting, both of you, of course, are at the White House every day, and seeing the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, really step up, because this is where Iran, as we've talked about on this pod in the past few weeks, has been able to really cause economic pain. And with the US blockade of Iranian ports, with that sanctions waiver ending soon, remember that there was a 30-day waiver on sanctions on Iranian oil ships that were already in the waters. With that ending soon, you wonder if that really might be the turning point.
Yeah, I mean, there's also a lot of pressure from US allies, both European allies, partners in the Gulf region. I mean, this is having a huge impact on their economies and the energy crisis writ large across the world. So, the expiration of these waivers is causing a lot of pain, and so there is, I think, a lot of external pressure to see both sides reach an agreement. The problem is, as you've alluded to, they are just so far apart on really key points, particularly the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. What does that look like? As you said, the Iranians have, you know, the idea that they could have this economic leverage was always sort of a hypothetical. Now we have seen that bear out, and asking them to let go of that is going to be a bit trickier. Also, their nuclear missile programs is as always a key sticking point. And I wonder how much we can see progress be made versus this just being, sort of frozen in place, or they just keep buying time. As you guys know, the Iranians are extremely good at dragging out negotiations.
And I think that's the big question is, this has kind of become a waiting game between the Iranians and the Trump administration to see who can kind of hold on to this kind of painful circumstance the longest. And I think the Iranians are clearly kind of hoping that the high petrol prices builds enough domestic pressure on Trump, in which he's a little more willing to negotiate to Iran's liking, whereas Trump kind of thinks that cutting Iran off from oil and financial markets will be painful enough that they'll either see kind of domestic pressure. If food, for example, could cause a protest in Iran again, as it did in January. They probably can't last more than a few months. Or that Iran just wants to kind of end this thing and limit the damage it's already suffered to its infrastructure. I think the Strait of Hormuz point is really interesting too, because that wasn't a stated objective of the campaign until after the campaign started, which puts the Trump administration in a kind of awkward position of having to explain that, how it became probably one of, if not the primary goal of the operation, was to keep the Strait of Hormuz open when it was open to begin with, when this began on February 28th.
When you talk about some of the economic pain for the rest of the world, I'm actually in this echoey room here because I'm at the uh, World Bank meetings that have been here all week and the IMF spring meetings. And I've also been over at the Semaphore World Economy Summit, just speaking to a number of leaders from the business world and also policymakers, and they are all clear that what needs to happen is for this war to end as quickly as possible, and more importantly, the Strait of Hormuz to open as quickly as possible to relieve some of that economic pain. And the Deputy Secretary General of the UN was telling me that the lasting impact for developing economies really is going to be felt for quite some time. And indeed, we saw in that IMF report that was released earlier this week that the impact of the war has been done, in the IMF's words. And the question of the duration of this war and how quickly shipping can be returned to normal, more or less, in the Strait of Hormuz. There's also the question, will it return to how it was before the war, is one that's existential to a number of countries, especially those who are dependent on commodities. So all of that, of course, that the Trump administration is hearing this pressure, but from what I can gauge from the president's words and from the administration's words, is they are really betting on these talks moving to the next phase. And there, back to your point, Courtney, the Iranians may have a card in being able to, let's say, sustain more of that pain that they're receiving, of course, from the Iranian ports being blocked as well, than the US administration. At least that might be what they're betting on. I wanted to ask you both, since you're both at the White House and covering President Trump every day, how you perceive some of President Trump's messaging, because we've seen him engage in a few spats this week, especially the one that's really blown up with the Pope, and that has had a massive impact here in the U.S. Among the Catholic community, but really surprised a lot of people around the world.
Yeah, I mean, that actually is something I've spoken to a lot of people about in the last couple of days for a piece I was working on, just about how much Trump's isolation, he's deepened his isolation on the world stage with some of the actions he's taken recently. A lot of this, of course, is filtered through the lens of the Iran war causing just mounting frustration around the world. But also, yes, him picking these fights with the Pope. This obviously isn't the first time he has criticized a Pope, or this Pope in particular. But that led the Giorgia Meloni of Italy, who is considered one of Trump's only friends left in Europe after the loss of Viktor Orban in Hungary. She then came out and said this is unacceptable, and she had some harsh words for the president. He, of course, responded in kind and offered some harsh words back. And I think this raises the question about where this leaves the US after the Iran conflict comes to a close, and whether these countries are, the reality that they don't seem to find the US as a reliable partner anymore. And in some cases, that is driving some of these Western countries to diversify, to rethink their partnerships with China, which is really projecting itself as as a stable partner in a world of volatility, in a world of chaos. And they haven't had to do much, but just show up. So we have seen a lot of these Western nations either go to Beijing or meet with President Xi. And I think that sets up a really tricky dynamic ahead of the president's meeting with Xi next month in May.
I think the problem also for the Trump administration is that these issues kind of compound on each other. I mean, the Pope issue and Maloney, for example, there had already been tensions with European allies over the Strait of Hormuz, and before that, even over Greenland. So they're all just kind of coming together and creating a much more prolonged spat, I guess you could call it, than any of those things taken individually. And I think domestically, it was really interesting to see the reaction to the AI generated image, which appears to show Trump as Jesus healing someone. We heard from people in conservative media and conservative circles here in DC, or even kind of conservative influencers like Riley Gaines, that you rarely hear that sort of very pointed criticism of the president in that sort of to that degree than you did after that image. And then I think, his, I don't want to call it an apology because it wasn't that, but his explanation that he thought it was a doctor, he thought he was a doctor standing next to a Red Cross worker, that really rang hollow even for a lot of the president's supporters. And for people like J.D. Vance, who is Catholic, it kind of created an awkward situation that I think few things have since Trump returned to the White House, at least domestically among his supporters.
Also for his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, another prominent Catholic, of course. And I find it so interesting because the Pope has not backed down either. I was just reading one of his later tweets in the week where he said, woe to those who manipulate religion and the very name of God for their own military, economic, and political gain. That message very clearly in this spat directed to President Trump, at least one of the parties he's directing that message to. And if President Trump has taken this in a way personally. He doesn't see why the Pope should be criticizing him and in calling the Pope weak on crime, which is, of course, not the case. I mean, I spoke to some members of the Catholic community this entire week, and a father who also said that his congregation, so a father priest, who said in his congregation there is a lot of head scratching in a way, people wondering why would President Trump not only take on the Pope but post that image that you referred to, Bernie. And I think we have to keep in mind that President Trump did have a very strong showing with Catholics in the election, right? Won about 55% of the vote, from what I remember. And it doesn't seem from the voices I spoke to that this would turn those Catholics against President Trump, but it does add to this question of his state of mind right now and how he sees the war. And in that, I also saw when the first round of negotiations were happening in Pakistan, it seemed that President Trump was content to there not being a deal at all. He said, well, it doesn't matter if there's a deal. And I thought, okay, is he entirely over this process? Is the war for him really well and truly over? Of course, he keeps saying we're close, but it's almost as if he's moved to the next phase, whether all of those military and strategic aims have been reached or not.
It's really interesting. To go back to the Pope thing and the blowback from the Catholic community. I will say we should note that Riley Gaines has since softened her criticism, right? So,
Yeah.
and which we've seen before, right? Where traditional supporters initially have a pretty harsh criticism of him and then sort of pull back a little bit. So, to your point, Sumi, I don't know that this will necessarily turn voters against him or the Republican Party in November, and then later in 28 when they decide who their candidate is. But I do think it's this question of like, is it death by a thousand cuts? And I liked Byrne's point about these issues sort of compounding each other. And front and center is this affordability issue, which I know you guys have talked about. I've talked about with you on this pod. So this war really putting it in the context of that. But the thing I wanted to say is, I think the way that I've been thinking about how he's thinking about it is how much he's tying this to his legacy. I've noticed that a lot of his achievements, his ambition and what he wants to do has been through this lens of like what his legacy looks like when he leaves here. He's turning 80 in June. He has pretty much, publicly acknowledged this will be his last term in office. I know he's flirted with the idea of running again, but putting that aside, I think that the way in which this war has been framed to him with proponents of it, who have argued for him to do this, was how legacy defining this could be. With the killing of the Ayatollah, completely, beheading the regime. And so, Donald Trump isn't very much a details guy. And so in his mind, I think he has achieved some of those legacy defining aims of really going for it when it comes to Iran in a way that he said, as he's mentioned, that his predecessors haven't. So I think that is something that we should think about when we think about how he's considering off ramps in this war.
And one trend I find kind of fascinating, and it's difficult to make kind of linkages between this and all these issues, but we've really, I think it's fair to say, seen slightly less of him in the last few weeks than we did previously. I mean, there's been far fewer of the sort of Oval Office marathon Q&A sort of things in which, he's happy to deliver really long answers on lots of different topics. He seems to have kind of shifted in favor of these short 2, 3, 4, 5 minute phone calls in a lot of respect, which, I mean, that kind of eliminates the possibility of any follow-on questions that put him in a position of having to explain his thinking or where he goes there. It's been kind of interesting to see that kind of take place at the White House. I mean, I think it's fair to say the daily pool reporters have been slightly less busy, and Trump seems content to kind of deliver brief comments. We saw him with the DoorDash delivery the other day, for example. But he's there's been much less of this sort of like kind of impromptu press event sort of thing that there has in the past. He seems kind of content to deliver very brief remarks and then let the policies, whether that be Iran or domestic policy, no tax on tips, for example, kind of speak for themselves.
That's a really interesting point. That leads us to, talking about his legacy and the thoughts about what impact he has had on the country will lead us to JD Vance. And I'm curious to get both of your takes on the vice president, the role that he's been playing. On the one hand, of course, stepping up as the natural predecessor, as President Trump's vice president. He looks, for all intents and purposes, to be the Republicans' man for 2028, although it could be Marco Rubio. But he's been front and center now, taking on the role of the negotiations in Islamabad. Of course, there is a point behind that. There's not a lot of trust between the Iranians and Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. So from what we understand, JD Vance was an important figure for the Iranians as well. That being said, putting him out there is really a test. And it is one where after the first round of negotiations, people were questioning, okay, can the vice president take this on in a way that the president needs him to? It's not an easy task, of course, to try to negotiate an agreement with Iran. We know the last one took 2 years to negotiate. But at the same time, he also went out to Hungary to campaign alongside Viktor Orban, who then lost in a landslide. And critically, in the criticism of the Pope that President Trump delivered, JD Vance doubled down on that criticism, saying that the Pope should be careful when speaking about theological issues, which, quite frankly, is the Pope's job in a way, isn't it? So I wonder if he's stepping forward, what image he's painting to the public in doing so.
I think it's impossible to be a vice president regardless of what administration you work for. We found that with the last one. You are having to prove your allegiance to the president and his administration as the sitting vice president, but with your eye on, an election 3 years from now. You're looking at how you're going to be viewed to the voters, how you're going to explain some of the decisions you've made. And as you guys both know, JD Vance was a vocal opponent of foreign intervention, certainly in Iran. He made that very clear before he joined the Trump administration, and has been forced to explain some of that and has, drawn a lot of scrutiny. So this, in some ways, was an opportunity to tie him closer to the Trump policy. But I also think it was a chance for him to sort of reconcile his past stances with his current stances in the Trump administration, in that he can say, I stepped in and helped bring this conflict to a close. I was the person that came in as a sort of peacemaker. But that being said, as we've just laid out, it's an impossible situation that could take a lot of time. So it's a huge gamble. And one thing I found interesting in talking to folks last week about JD Vance in stepping into this role was, the administration has said that the president had asked him to do this, but I had talked to some people who said he raised his hand. He wanted to step forward and do this. And so I do think there is a little bit of calculation on how he can position himself if he should run in 2028. And also Steve Witkoff suggested him, according to some officials who I spoke to, because they view JD Vance as an elected official that Americans put on the ballot and elected on the ballot. So he is a sort of trusted person to send to Pakistan to these talks and prove to the Iranians that they're serious about these negotiations and that this isn't just another ploy where they're going to pretend that they're going to negotiate and then, bomb Iran as they have in the past.
I think part of that calculation is that if talks don't work out and the war resumes, they can blame that on the Iranians, and then Vance doesn't necessarily seem to be at fault in any way. Whereas, so I think it's in some regards maybe not a win-win, but the loss is a little harder to define. If the negotiations don't work out, they say, well, the Iranians didn't come to an agreement, and we said from the beginning that we were ready to go again. I think the trip to Hungary is slightly more complicated to explain, because to see Orban's numbers go down after Vance arrived, I think not only is it something that maybe people will say reflects on Vance, but it's also kind of a reflection of how much influence the Trump administration can still have on politics overseas, whether that be in Hungary, Brazil, elsewhere in Latin America. There are other politicians around the world that kind of count on that support from the Trump administration.
What do you guys think about his comments about the Pope? I mean, he's a relatively new convert to Catholicism, and he's this book coming out about his journey to Catholicism.
Yeah, identity politics are very tricky, and JD Vance is finding that out, particularly when you're in government and you're representing the administration that, or you're working for a president who doesn't have a penchant for apologies, who never seems to back down from his positions. And so I think, again, it just puts JD Vance in this very complicated position of trying to support the president in his current role, but also explain himself when he steps out and tries to forge his own political career and his ambitions for higher office.
Yeah, I think in general, we've seen kind of the administration look to those sort of identity politics more and more as we head towards the midterms and eventually towards the next presidential election. We've seen, kind of policies that I think it's fair to say is kind of broadly popular with socially conservative Catholics and other Christians. You see the issue of transgenders, sports come up quite a lot now, kind of unprompted, and I think they're all kind of that's very concerted effort to reach out to those people, even if they might not necessarily agree with what the president says about the Pope, for example.
Well, guys, it's certainly going to be something interesting to watch in the coming weeks, the role that JD Vance continues to play. And when we talk again, that window of the ceasefire will have ended. So it'll be a fresh week to talk about the war in Iran as well. So I guess we'll see you guys next time. And you can catch up with all of the episodes of The President's Path on BBC iPlayer if you're in the UK.
Or on YouTube if you're anywhere else in the world.
And if you want to get in touch, you can email us at path@bbc.co.uk.